Music is not just an expression, it's the translation of a civilizational search for meaning, to life, death, to deceit and hope, to love. In fact, it's a translation of philosophy which answers without words, when there are no lyrics, into the meaning of life through so many answers, or rather thought-provoking answers for each of us, when the music is not an entertainment, is not a purposeful adjustment towards an occasion, be it jolly for dance or even spiritual uplifting, let's say for funeral. Beyond the occasion, the music is a language that talks to us through harmony, polyphony, dissonance, consonance, just like syllables of a language. And even if we don't understand the meaning of it, we listen to the sound of the words, like in poetry, not necessarily the meaning, or not a single meaning. There are so many meanings. The same piece means so many things to so many musicians, which is really mind-boggling for students who seek a definitive, firm answer about the tempo, the articulation, the phrasing, the rubato, the style. And of course, the answers are within the score, the written element, which is a notation of a thought, or a notation of a fleeting moment, which meant so much to a composer in the past, or the present, or the distant past, in their own present, to leave it on a scroll, on a paper, in fact, unnecessarily undefined, because even if scholarly, we can search archaeologically into all kinds of hints between the notes, as we can say about between the words for a text. The translation is not necessarily the meaning. The translation is the interpretation, therefore, etymologically, an interpretation is a translation, is the way to understand what the world is within the time capsule when it was composed. What are the operas? What are the myths? What are the storytellings which were important? What were the controversies? What were the hopes and deceits? What were the time periods, yearnings and searchings, mathematically, cosmologically, politically, religiously? You cannot take out the music composed from its context, though you can separate it from the life of the composer, because the author's composition or creation is largely larger than their own human condition. It's given to them, through them, to express some truths that touch us beyond time today. And of course, decontextualizing it, it's just gymnastics on the keyboard for a pianist. Of course, without the technique, you cannot express the meaning, whichever meaning you think it is, wrong or right, or evolving into understanding it better through your life. And as a teacher, being the hyphen between the text and the student's yearning, but at any level, the technique by itself is not the answer. It's a tool which has to disappear, to be forgotten, in fact, the thread that connects the soul and the body. But it's not visible. A bit like the notation has bar lines, but you don't hear bar lines when a singer sings an aria. or a pianist sings a melodic line through the piano, suggestive of, let's say, lyrics. But if not, at least the purposeful direction of a phrase, a meaning, a storytelling, a narration. Humans need to be told storytellings, either to be uplifting and kind of beyond their reality of the day or limitations of the day. They sense there is something bigger than them, the mysterium, beyond what individual faiths are. You come to the artwork, would it be an architecture building with a purpose that we're not sure we detect for the distant past, but the form by itself, the meaning that we put in a work of art is what it's in the eye of the beholder, in a painting, in a theater play, in a thought-provoking theater playwrights, moving dogmas and points of view and breaking rules, creating new rules, or perhaps bringing people to a wrong direction through an ideology. But whichever way, it's what makes us very humble is to serve the muse in music, which is the technique towards the tools in order to express ourselves so fully that what we play in music for a listener who doesn't know the piece is a concentration of meaning, of atmosphere, of involvement, of a statement, of believing in a narration which reaches beyond stylistic knowledge, beyond scholarly awareness by people who would be informed and who therefore can disagree aesthetically. And that is their right once they're informed about what they think the work is and how it's supposed to be presented. One learns grammar to learn one's own mother tongue, which one learned by ear. Music is learned by ear, and then the grammar of music brings us to understand it better. Not all people who learn grammar become writers, but they can read on their own, understand or misunderstand a book without somebody reading it to them. An interpreter in music is a bit of a reader, loud voice to an audience with a storytelling. And if the audience is aware of the piece, either because they played it or they learned it or they studied it or they compared it with other interpretations, they're already just like watching a film where you read the book before the script of which the book was adapted into a script, then you watch it with more critical opinion because you realize that cuts were done and choices were made about what to keep and what not to in the storytelling. Therefore, when you're not, you just listen to it for what it is, and if you find it captivating, it's because it was either well told, either edited in a way that kept you on your toes. But in both ways, intuitively or knowledgeably, you accept that the performance of the music is the conviction of the person who is playing it for you, just like a conductor picks up an upbeat and leads the beats ahead and the orchestra follows the vision of the conductor who doesn't play. In the case of a pianist by themselves, they do play and conduct and narrate and sing and suggest psychologically the phrasing direction as if it were lyrics. And because there are no specific lyrics, then the psychological dimension of the gestures, of the intervals, of the leaps or not, or what, the dissonance or the consonances, all of these elements are suggestive at different levels of the subconscious of the listener, unaware or aware of the score. And I insist very much on this because I think sometimes the interpretation of a performer has to be readable. What I mean is, you understand that they have read it, and then they have brought it to you for what it means to them. It's not just an objective reading of the right notes in the right rhythm, trying to keep the right tempo. Beyond that, without taking further too many freedoms, where then you adapt the text to the point to which you retell it your own way, it becomes perhaps then paraphrase or a transcription, not an interpretation, or at least a translation, therefore, of the text. But there is no objectivity in it. There is a subjective element that is filtered by the culture of the performer, their experience of life, what they understood or misunderstood of the meaning of this 18th, 17th, 16th centuries point of view, of the drive, of the meaning, of the elevation of the spirit, the genre, the style, the aesthetics, the singing, the polyphony, the monophony, the harmonization, the atonalization, the tensions, the releases, all the elements that in fact are suggestive of the narrative storytelling. And it becomes very much something that is no more formatted like a 3-minute pop song, alternating different expected elements. It becomes a free statement, even if the form is adapted and eventually broken to be reformed, like the sonata, the fantasy, which by essence is unformatted, and then improvisatory notation. But the symphony and opera seria compared to the bel canto or the verismo, all these elements are made of shapes which are made to be broken in order to express the purpose of it. The purpose of a sonata is not its form. It's through its form. It organizes certainly the chaos of nature to bring in two thematic materials, and then the mind controlling these two materials plays with these contrasting themes in a development and then unifies them through tonal or other ways in the recapitulation. So it's a way of man to control nature. But it's not purposely by itself that the sonata form is expressive. And even if when the sonata form evolves in its rigid unapplication into one movement cyclic, like in Liszt or many different ways, that's only the title left sonata resonant. But it doesn't mean that only the structure justifies the content, or then the content without the structure. It is something that it's important for us musicians, especially when we translate it, transmit it to students who are then the next spokesman of the piece to the next generation of highlighted ways of bringing the music to the listeners, who then will be shaped by this performer's intelligence or reading, or next generation bringing what they think is stylistically right, regardless if it's instrumental or just the phrasing, because it can be on an instrument on which it wasn't composed, but the ears are not the same, the expectations are not the same in terms of concentration, silence, the sense of romantic era's longing is lost in today's immediacy in many things. And so the psychology to place ourselves in a position to receive and state a musical statement with its own context, but with today's standards of expectation of, let's say, lesser length of concentration for the listener. Like, I often hear people say, don't play the repeat, it's too long or boring. But it's part of the structure, but it's also part of the statement. It's a term of endearment. It's restating the meaning. It's part of the expression. You cannot take out the air of the tire just because you don't like how much it's inflated. It has to be part of it, even if it appears redundant to today's standards. But then we shouldn't play the music of the past with today's binocles. We should play it with yesterday's binocles. And what is timeless. It's not the form, it's the essence of it. And we have to accept that the restatement is part of the music. It's not just a repeat that can be taken out if we think it's redundant, or then if not, we need to make it so that it's less boring by changing its colorization or its statement. I think it's belittling the work that we're supposed to serve honestly for what it is or what we believe it is, and not make it suitable to our seduction on audience for today's audiences on stage. Because I think sometimes the articulation of the instrument, the effect of some tempi goes beyond what the composers imagined. And it's not wrong. After all, the piece is not set and frozen in time. The composer doesn't own it. The composer gave it to us, and it's what we made of it. Since that creates perhaps a tradition, or breaking the tradition, how to express it. But nevertheless, the meaning of the purpose of it is the essence of it, which meant so much, and it's timeless enough because philosophy brings us to always rethink the same elements of humans' yearning for the purpose of it all, of themselves, and of what is meaningful to them, and how they express what is their anxiety, their hope, their drive, their sense of abandon in the observance of the beauty of nature, when the music is the, in fact, sound mirror of nature. And then it becomes also the meaning translation of the thought process of the humans who organize and elucubrate all kinds of thoughtful, formal expressions. I find that to be fascinating, to enter in the thought process of a composer and wonder what he or she meant and why they did it the way they did it, beyond the improvisatory notation or the structural writing. And to which extent it's frozen in time or stuck in its certain tradition, because since we have the 20th century, a lot of recordings and published editions and scholarly articles and music scholars who give us guidelines, and then in a way it's a little bit tightening us into their rules. But these rules are to be broken if with love and meaning, not necessarily for the purpose of it or for some eccentricity. It's just about the fact that it has to correspond to the deep meaning of what it means to us. So the analytical approach of a reading of a notation gives us a lot of answers about what they are there to compensate or overstate or hint about, and what we think it is that they hint about, and how much we're supposed to bring it out or how much we're supposed to not bring it out. Or in other words, it's in our own best interest to develop a sense of proportion and taste and aesthetic meaning of what we think it meant then and what it means to us today, because after all, the music of yesterday is present today when we perform it, and for the audience and for the students. It's not a museum piece by itself, even if it could be that, given the centuries before which it was composed or left for us to serve, play, record, republish, or eventually through the teaching, reevaluate its meaning and how we're supposed to approach it. All this brings us to stay very humble in front of the question marks about what it is that we're supposed to do with the score. And when a student asks the very basic question, how am I supposed to approach this? Fast, slow, loud, soft, pedal, no pedal for pianists, which fingering, which phrasing? We don't need to breathe like singers or wind players, but we need to find punctuations. Therefore, we need to organize the articulation intellectually on the piano for the storytelling, and the tempo and the pulse, which is not the same thing. And the rubato is certain freedom in the storytelling, where you take psychological breaths to restate statements, or perhaps to go beyond the expected phrasing and build it to a more distant stretch, and you arch your phrase and you start becoming a storyteller who intrigues the listener, who is compelled to follow where you try to bring them intellectually in your reading or rendering, in that case, both. Of a score. And of course, if it's in chamber music with orchestra, the more you multiply or divide rather the choices in order to match them together, not just play together, but to organize the movement of the phrase in the same direction. All these elements of music making then, instead of becoming more rigid because shared, should become more flexible, because by adhesion you adhere to an idea that is imposed by the structure of the piece itself. Some people have more notes to play, others have less notes to play, therefore the active sections of the voicing compared to the less active. It's a dialogue, it's a sometimes contradictory, sometimes it's purposely thought-provoking in its collisional expression. The music is a language of its own, with its own psychology, that we might misunderstand or assume to understand, and sometimes we have to agree to accept humbly, to question when we discover how somebody else hears it, reads it, and presents it, or perhaps by ourselves through our readings of other books, of other philosophies, of other elements, highlighting the understanding of the world to a certain extent, evolves the evolving understanding of something learned earlier in music, is highlighted by who you have become as a human. It's filtered through your culture. So therefore you don't play just the gymnastic notes organized correctly, but you play a filter of your deep meaning of what this piece is to you. And you can say, oh, when I was younger I liked it that way, and now I like it less this way or more that way, the rubato, the tempo, the phrasing. One can find so much more in the same piece that reveals itself to us as a gift that keeps on giving, that it's humbling, and at the same time it's a bottomless pit. But in the process it's exhilarating. As the philosopher says, the purpose of the trip is the trip itself, not necessarily the arrival point, which is sort of a fleeing horizon that we cannot catch because it keeps going further the more we try to get to it, to seize the unseizable, to try to bring a sense of the soul of things, but the soul is not seizable either. It's something that you have to be in a state of mind to be able to receive it and to be able to transmit it. But at the same time, you have to organize it, and so you have to be in control of the technique while not in control of the expression, in order to let every time you play through the piece, reimagine it with its different ways it reveals itself to you. It's almost as if a painter has to repaint the painting every morning the gallery opens, and not just have the points of view of the viewers who like it or understand it or don't understand it, but it's the same painting. Here it's the score is there, but the ways it comes out through the instrument or the mood of the moment or the situation or the nervousness or the expectation. In other words, the awareness, the hearing, the way we understand it in the storytelling, even if it's retold so many times after repeated practicing, which can be boring by essence because it's repetitive, in order to learn cognitively how to manage it and to be less surprised by the unexpected. Nevertheless, or manage the unexpected better rather, that's more humbling. But nevertheless, it is important to keep in mind that we're here to put ourselves in question every time we start the piece from A to Z, even if we have a projected path through it for having either by experience performed it a lot, either by practicing it before we have experience of performing it a lot. In other words, we have an imagination of an ideal path ahead, and then the unexpected happens, the bumps on the road, there where you expect them, or there you fear them, or there where you don't fear them. And then you deal with that. And when you deal with that, you realize that every time you go through the piece, it's never going to be twice the same. Even if you try to organize it in repetitive practicing, to rationalize it to each detail, where you can be reliable technically and psychologically and not depend of the, let's say, emotion of the moment. All these are very easy concepts to align like I just did in words, but it's also exhilarating because you feel every time you're given a chance to serve the piece in front of people, that's the purpose of it, and you take it for the privilege which it is, and I really think I'm very privileged. And I think that to have been a student of a great teacher and being a teacher of great students is very humbling too, especially when the pieces are musically so meaningful, and of course for the famous ones, so recorded, played and heard that most students play them by ear rather than by reading the notes and rethinking them, compared to a new piece which has a music language that is not familiar to them, and they have to really read it to play it, not just play it by ear. But the ear matters. It's a guide. It's an intuitive guide. It's a conductor of the musicians, without which we don't hear the subtlety, the phrasing, the legato, the half legato, the mezzo pianissimo, the articulation that can be half legato but not totally wet staccato. And we enter in this minute subtleties where we express so many things that are hinted and that are so meaningful, without which the discourse of the music is banal, even if it's beautiful by itself. And so it's a lot of these elements that you put in work when you practice repetitively in order to, let's say, manage to be less surprised by the unexpected. And the unexpected always happens.